Hi there, welcome to the Upcycle Design Lab. My name's Cindy and I craft using recycled and repurposed materials. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around and check out some of my other upcycling tutorials. And if you like what you see, you can check the subscribe button below any of my videos to become a subscriber. So today we're going to be working on part 3 of my first quilt. If you know the story, some friends gave me some t-shirts and asked me to make a quilt for them, and I'm finally getting around to it. So if you missed the first 2 parts of this series, you can get to them in the comment section of this video. But for today, we're finally ready to start sewing some of the squares together. So I'm a little bit nervous. I hope I did made some good cuts so that I can actually match up the corners and make everything look nice and tidy. And then we'll also be basting, hopefully pin basting the quilt together. I want to quickly recap the first 2 videos before we proceed with part 3. In part 1, I discussed sketching a rough design and how to plan and organize the quilt pieces before cutting up the t-shirts. All of my t-shirts that I'm using are from music venues and concerts, so I decided to add a musical quote to the quilt using a product called Heat and Bond to cut and fuse the letters of my quote to the quilt squares. And once I'd done a rough cut of the quilt squares, I laid out all of the pieces to make sure that I liked the placement of all the blocks. In part 2, each block was stabilized with some interfacing or other fusible product and then trimmed to the sewing dimensions using a rotary cutter and a quilter's square. And all of the letter and 2-part blocks were assembled with the Heat and Bond and then sewn to secure the pieces together. Before we get started, here's a quick recap of the tools and materials that I will be using in this video. If you're interested, you can find links to purchase these items in the comment section of this video. Before we get started sewing the blocks together, I just wanted to mention that if you're working with t-shirts to make your quilt, you may find a few screen prints with flaws, like this one where the screen print looks a little washed out and worn. In some cases you may have small stains, pen marks, or bleach marks. I do have all of these problems on a couple of different blocks. But with a little creativity, you can probably still use your flawed screen prints. So for the 3 problem blocks that I have, I'm going to show you the 3 different ideas I have to fix them. I'm sure there are many other techniques that you could use to fix your damaged screen prints, but these are just the 3 that I came up with. So for this first print, I just wanted to make the white a little crisper. I'm not so worried about the inside of the letters as I am about the edges. So to fix this block, I'm simply going to use my white gel pen to remake the outlines of the letters in this artwork. For this next block, I thought about leaving it, but in really good lighting, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but there's a little bit of it looks like maybe an oil stain right here. And so my idea for this one, my sewing machine does several different specialty stitches. So I've kind of tested out some different stitches, but I think this little star or flowery stitch is going to be the best. So I'm planning to do this stitch just in a little short curve pattern here to cover or at least camouflage this oil stain, and then I'll put a little matching one on this side, and I think this thread color will be a fairly good match to this little bottom bit of the art. So I've gone ahead and drawn a little line here to cover the oil spot here, and then I drew just another parallel line over here to match it. And to do that, I'm just using my disappearing marker. So over time, this line will disappear, and if you want to, you can add a little bit of water to make it disappear faster. But I'm just using that for my stitch guide. This last block has a couple of different problems. There's a pen mark here and down at the bottom, and then there's also some bleach stains. I think this part will disappear into the seam once it's sewn, but to fix these other spots, I've decided to add some musical notes made out of the t-shirt fabric. And to do that, I'm doing a technique similar to the two-part blocks that we did in the last video, but these pieces that I'm applying are a little bit smaller than our two-part blocks. So I came up, because this whole thing has a music theme to it, I'm just doing a very subtle sort of musical notes and staff design here. And I wanted it to be, like I said, subtle, so I'm using the t-shirt fabric, the same t-shirt fabric color, to make my music staff here. And then, like I said, I have a couple musical notes, and they just have the heat and bond on the back, which has allowed me to cut them out in these shapes. So I'm just going to go ahead and adhere these to the block to cover up these flaws, and I'll just be using my iron to do that to finish this off, and then I'll go back and I'll stitch these down so that they'll stay on a little bit better. So I'm finally ready to start sewing my quilt blocks together, and if all my blocks were the same size, I could just start sewing them in rows and then sew the rows together. But since I have different sized blocks, I'm going to be sewing the quilt in 3 different sections. So I've gone back to my diagram here and sort of decided which sections to sew together. Now, as I've mentioned before, I'm not a quilt expert, and this is my first quilt that I've ever really made, so I don't know the official best practice to sew your quilt together, but I've decided that I'm going to sort of start in this center and then work my way out and then build each center and each section and then sew the sections together. I don't think it really matters how you build your quilt as long as you keep your corners aligned correctly, which goes back to the accuracy of your cutting and the accuracy of your sewing. So I'm ready to start sewing. I've pinned my first few blocks together, and I'm ready to take them over to the sewing machine. Alright, I have my machine threaded with a neutral thread color. I'm just using cream. You could use gray or whatever choice you wanted to use. I'm using a ballpoint needle, like I said, which is specifically for sewing knits, and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm just going to start out kind of slowly until I get the feel of my fabric and my seam allowance, and I'll get these first few pieces sewn together. So I've got my first 4 pieces sewn together, and I'm going to go ahead and take my tags off now. And this next step is kind of optional. Some people just push their seams to one side, and some folks like to press their seams open. I've decided, it takes a little bit longer, but I've decided I want to press my seams open just because I think it'll give it a little smoother finish, and that way I don't have to worry about if you do sew your seam to one side or the other, you want the other seam to go the opposite way. You want to make sure you got the bottom going the same direction. It just seems like it might be a little more to keep track of than I want to worry about. So I'm going to just take the extra step of pressing my seams open. So I'm ready to sew some more pieces, and I think the next two I'm going to do are these two pieces above my lettering here. So I've found those appropriate pieces and I'm going to stitch them together, and I'm just marking off the pieces as I sew them. So I'm going to sew these top two pieces together and then I'll attach them to my lettering. So I've got these two more pieces sewn together, or to each other, and now it's time to match them up with my letter blocks. So the only seam I have is this center seam, so I want to make sure that I've got those seams aligned, and then my edges should match up on the end. So I'll go ahead and pin that piece and sew it, and I'll just keep building my quilt out until I have the first section done. So I've got my first few pieces sewn together here, and my first corner looks really good. My second corner I missed a little bit, so I let it slip or didn't pin it quite correctly. And then, true confessions, I actually had a little difficulty on keeping a 1/4 inch stitch on my letter blocks. I figured out how to hold it better and do a better job, so I've got that figured out, but it did sort of mess up my ends here on this first part. So I don't recommend doing this, but if you do have a little leftover, I'm gonna go ahead and trim it off with my rotary trimmer and just make sure that my edges are even again. And hopefully I'll just do a better, more accurate job of sewing from here on out. A couple more thoughts on the sewing. Hopefully you can see this, but I don't know, maybe most sewers always pin with the pins going perpendicular to the seam, but I've used to put them in just kind of parallel, and then I'd pull them out as I was going. But because you want to keep your edges even, and I think it just works better to put the pins in this way, and maybe most professional sewers do it that way anyway. So like I said, you want to work pretty slowly. You definitely don't want to sew over your pins, so get them out of the way before you start. And then what I do, because sometimes the fabric, the top piece of fabric will pull this way, and so you get a smaller seam. So I like to leave my pins in all the way till I almost get to where I'm going to stitch on top of them. You can see the top layer is pulling away just a little bit here, so I want to leave my pin in all the way almost until I get to my needle, and then I'm going to pull it out and stitch. You can put the pins closer together if you need to, but this just kind of helps you at least check back in and make sure that your seams are even. Oops, I sewed over that pin. Don't do that. And especially on the end, I leave the pin in right till I'm almost on top of it. You want to be sure that you're back stitching on all of your seams so that you're securing your threads at the beginning and the end. So let me see if I can show you. You can see how this back seam is a little bit longer than the front seam, and that's probably okay with that much difference, but you do want to avoid that as much as possible, and you certainly don't want to make it any worse than that. So that's why I like to leave the pins in almost till I'm sewing on top of them, especially because normally if you're used to sewing clothing, you're used to a 5/8 inch seam, and this 1/4 inch seam can slip away from you pretty quickly, so you want to be careful and work slowly and stay on top of it. So I'm just lining up my fabric, back stitching to the edge of my fabric, and then proceeding, nice even pace, trying to hold my fabrics so the edges stay even together. Just sort of pull out my pin at the last minute. The other thing that helps keep your fabric straight is if you have everything even and flat out on your table and you can sew nice and evenly. When you're working with bigger pieces, that gets a little more difficult. See, I'm sliding off there a little bit again. You can pick up the presser foot and kind of push your fabric back down a little bit if you want to as well. Hold it with your finger. But I like just to kind of leave the pin in as long as I can. And of course you're working with fabric, so it's not perfect, but you want to stay as clean and tight on your seams as possible so that everything matches up when you're ready to sew it together. So I just finished sewing these bottom smaller blocks here, and I'm going to go ahead and press the seams open before I sew them to the bigger block. I've kind of crossed off the blocks as I've sewn them together. So you can see I have my whole center section completed, and I have the middle of the top section done. And then once I have sewn these pieces to the bigger piece, I'll sew these 3 pieces and attach them, and sew these 3 pieces and attach them. And then I'll work on the bottom section and sew the sections together. I'm just showing you this so that you can kind of have a plan of action for when you're sewing your blocks together. So I'm going to go ahead and press the seams open, and then we'll pin the 2 pieces together. All right, so we're at a moment of truth here. I'm about to do this wrong too. Because I have my is music stitched out. So the first thing is, does it match up? And it's actually a little off, but I think it'll be close. The other thing is, I was about to pin it to the top, and I need to pin it to the bottom. So we'll get that corrected. You always want to be sure you're checking your sketch before you pin and sew. So, pull this the other direction here. But of course I do want it to read this way. So I'm going to flip it this way. Now I don't know if it was smart or just lucky that because my blocks are different sizes, a lot of times I don't have to match up the corners. But in any cases where you do, you want to start at those seams and pin there first, making sure that you're matching up the edges of your fabric as well. So I just have 3 seams to match here, I guess. And then I don't think this is in the frame, but you want to go back and match up your ends as well. And then you can just pin at whatever intervals you're comfortable sewing with. I like them every couple inches just because like I said, the seams are so small. I'm not used to sewing with the 1/4 inch seam. So you have to be a little more careful. And once I get it all pinned, I will go ahead and just double check that everything is in the right spot. You don't want to be sewing things upside down. So that looks good. I'll finish pinning it and then I'll sew it together, be back to press open that seam, and then I'll work on those smaller sections of blocks that I showed you earlier. So I finished sewing my 3 sections together, and I just need to piece the 2 more seams together to get the whole thing sewn up. But I just wanted to mention that it was pretty easy to line up the corners. Once you stabilize the knit, it helps a lot to get your corners pretty square. And then, like I said, in some cases I didn't end up needing to match corners, and I wasn't perfect in all of my corners, but it was easier to match them than I thought it was. I was a little nervous about it to start with. So I'm ready to pin my last piece together here. And it's getting kind of big and unruly, I'm not gonna lie. So I want to be sure that I'm pinning my, like I said, I want to be sure I'm pinning my seams first, the ones that have to match, and then my ends, so that I get everything pieced together nice and smoothly. So this is my top piece. And this is my center seam right here. So now I got to grab my really unruly piece. So like I said, this is my center seam, so I want to make sure I match that up first. And then I've got a seam here that needs to match. And on the other side. I probably should have a bigger table, but I don't. Got one more seam and then the end. And then I'll just come back and fill in with my pins to keep my edges even. But I want to be sure I have all my critical points matched up first. And even though I don't have seams to match here, I want to make sure I'm kind of pinning right in the center to hold my seam open on the bottom side here. And I've been putting a lot of pins in just to keep my edges even, especially the bigger and more unruly it gets. But you can certainly put as many as you're comfortable. So I'm going to finish pinning this and then I'll sew my last piece together and I'll be ready to do the pin basting. So I'm ready to pin baste my quilt together, and to do that I have just a plain flat sheet that I'm going to use for the backing. I've got all of my quilted squares sewn together here, and then I just have a low fill or lightweight large batting that's made, it should be queen size, so it should be plenty big enough. And I have some safety pins. Now I've seen other people do it and they have much larger safety pins, so I'm hoping that these will work because this is what I have. I also am working on my dining room table, so I'm gonna have to be a little careful not to scratch it. But the first thing is just to lay everything out flat. So the sheet will be on the bottom, then the polyfill, and then I'll put my quilt pieces on top. And just make sure everything is smooth, and then I'll start to do the pinning. So just a quick note here, if you're using a new sheet, as I am, you'll notice it's pretty wrinkled when it comes out of the packaging. So I'm going to stop here and iron it flat before I pin all of the layers together. So once I had the sheet pressed, I just centered it on my dining room table. and then I layered the quilt batting on top. And the quilt batting is a little bit tricky to work with. It kind of sticks together and is hard to get flattened out. But once that was done, I laid all of my quilt pieces on top with everything kind of centered in the middle of the table. I think my pins are going to work. I did see other folks using pins to baste, and they just kind of stuck the pins through without lifting up the fabric, which I think is probably ideal because you want to keep everything smooth. But because my pins are so small and I don't want to scratch my table, I am reaching under to put my pin in. I couldn't get the pin all the way through without doing that. Now I don't know. I think, you know, it's just going to take a little bit longer, but I'm just going to have to smooth everything out again after I reach under there. And as I get closer to the edge, it'll be easier. So I'm going to pin all of my intersections and then do some random pins inside of these bigger squares, just so that I have a pin at least every 6 inches or so. Bigger safety pins would have certainly made this easier, so I would highly recommend, if you don't have safety pins, get larger size. And I don't know if I mentioned, but you want to, I started in the center, and then I'm just kind of working my way out. I'll move the quilt around on the table as I need to get the edges done. And you can't see this right now, but the sheet that I bought is a king size, and like I said, the quilting batting was for a queen size quilt, so I have a lot of excess on the edge, and you do need some excess. I don't know how much. I'll probably end up trimming some of it off, but better to have more than you need than less. So I'm going to continue pinning, and then I'll flip this over and just make sure that my back piece isn't puckered anywhere because I'm having to lift up the edge to do my pinning. Here's a look at the back of my quilt, and everything looks pretty smooth, so I think my pin basting is good. Since my sheet and my batting were quite a bit bigger than my quilt itself, I decided to finish off the edges by just rolling the sheet around the batting, which kind of protects it, and then I just pinned it together at the edge of my quilt to keep everything a little more secure and tidy while I'm working on the quilt. So I'm all finished with the pin basting. I ended up doing the pins about 2 inches apart, which seems like a good spacing. And when you flip the back over, it looks pretty smooth, so I don't think there was too much puckering or problems with the way that I did the pin basting. So my next step is to get it onto my quilting frame and start some quilting. Anyway, if you missed some of these videos, please check the comments and you can get caught up. Also, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon here in the lab.